On the Democratic side of the race, polls show Hillary Clinton with a sizable lead over Bernie Sanders in the Empire State. As the candidates prepare for Thursday's debate in Brooklyn, Clinton has been focusing on gun control in her attacks against Sanders. She blamed Sanders' home state of Vermont for selling many of the guns used to commit crimes in New York. Sanders fired back, questioning Clinton's credibility on issues like Wall Street reform, fracking, and campaign finance. Nancy Cortez is in Washington. Nancy, both Clinton and Sanders are on the attack a week out from the New York primary. Here's some of their more recent jabs at each other.
I have noticed that under the bright spotlight and scrutiny here in New York, Senator Sanders has had trouble answering questions. He's had trouble answering questions about his core issue, namely dealing with the banks. He's had trouble answering foreign policy questions.
You can tell a great deal about what candidates will do based on how they raise their campaign funds. Does anybody seriously believe that you can be an agent of change if you are taking money from the most powerful special interest in this country? Secretary Clinton was then a United States Senator from your state. Her judgment was faulty. She voted for that disastrous war.
So his campaign is pushing this idea of a quote-unquote credibility gap, and the Clinton camp has deflected it. One of her aides tweeted Tuesday, Bernie Sanders, you can spend your day talking about the credibility gap. We'll be talking about the wage gap. So, Nancy, how successful has this strategy been? How has she worked to discredit Bernie Sanders?
Well, right now, they're both trying to discredit each other for very different reasons. Bernie Sanders, as you heard, went on that big tear against Clinton in a campaign event today. He has really been ramping up his attacks because he knows that New York is crucial to his very narrow path at this point to the nomination. If he doesn't somehow win in New York, he has almost no shot of catching up to Clinton. So he's not leaving anything on the table. He's going after her every which way he can, because right now there is a polling gap between Sanders and Clinton of 12 to 14 points. Clinton, on the other hand, is kind of hoping that she can dispatch with Sanders once and for all if she wins decisively in New York. Then she can really argue, look, there is no mathematical way practically for him to catch up unless he starts winning 80% of the vote everywhere else, and that's not going to happen. And so she's raising questions about whether he really knows his stuff. You know, yes, he's passionate, but has he really thought these ideas through? And there's no question that we are seeing a heightening of the conflict between these two in the rough and tumble state of New York.
Yeah, so Nancy, you mentioned polls there. The narrative now for some time has been Clinton's delegate math versus Sanders' momentum. But in the latest 3 polls from New York, Clinton is leading by double digits while Sanders has cut into his deficit. You know, New York does still remain a long shot. So how is his campaign framing the possibility of a win for him?
Well, they're still arguing that he is going to win. In fact, he said at a campaign event in Syracuse this afternoon that point blank, he is going to win in New York. And he has come back from behind before. We saw that happen in Michigan, where he had a surprise win. We saw that happen in Wisconsin, where he won by double digits. So it can happen. However, in this case, you're talking about a state that is Hillary Clinton's home state, the state that she represented for 8 years. And her polling numbers have remained remarkably stable throughout this Bernie Sanders winning streak. There was this concern in her camp that perhaps he would come barreling out of Wisconsin with a big victory there, and New Yorkers would start to sort of sit up and give him a second look. But at this point, it doesn't seem like that is happening, although they do still have a week to go.
Yeah, I mean, if he doesn't win New York, Nancy, then I guess the question is, how narrow does a possible path to the nomination become for Bernie Sanders?
It becomes extremely narrow, although that doesn't necessarily mean that he will drop out of the race. You know, back when Bernie Sanders got into this race, he probably also believed that his path was very narrow, but he got in because he wanted to make a point. He wanted to make sure that his issues, trade, income inequality, were part of the conversation. Along the way, he picked up millions of followers, millions of dollars, and did better than anyone expected. So just because his path is narrowing now doesn't mean that he's suddenly going to pack up his toys and go home, because he wants to make sure that these issues remain part of the conversation, not just in the primary election, and he has had a big impact on that conversation. They are talking about his issues all the time, but he wants to make sure that it's still an issue in the general election, and that whoever becomes president has made promises that line up with his view of the world.
Well, Nancy, with a deficit of more than 200 pledged delegates against Clinton, Sanders has turned his attention to wooing undecided super delegates. So I guess the question is, how does one begin to change the minds of super delegates?
You know, it's really hard when you don't have a compelling argument that you're the one who's picking up steam at the end. You are about to overtake the front runner, and that you know that they committed to Hillary Clinton early on, but now look at how close you've gotten. You can't really make that argument when you're still 200 delegates back in the pledged delegate count. You know, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama back in 2008 were much closer. They were neck and neck almost until the end. So, you know, that was much more of a nail biter. In this case, it isn't. And so, barring some kind of major collapse for the Clinton campaign, some big game changer, it's going to be very hard for Sanders to convince more than a few superdelegates to go his way.
All right, Nancy Cordes in Washington for us. Nancy, thanks so much.
You're welcome.